Hello everyone, today we talk about the role of monasticism and of the church in the preservation of a written culture in early medieval Europe. We have already addressed in the past this topic, but let's widen it just a little bit in terms of especially linguistical aspects. I would say so. Naturally, all the we're talking strictly about Western Europe, of course, but Romano-Germanic or Latin-Germanic Europe, if you prefer, this society in which the political and military ruling classes in every single kingdom that had formed over the ruins of the Western Roman Empire were of Germanic origin, and therefore, as we have seen many times, they were substantially illiterate. Right, so there is this great path of civilization, of education, of learning, of cultural mediation, in which the church definitely is the protagonist, and in a first phase, especially its bishops, right, that represented almost everywhere the only organized group that was capable of providing some element of continuity with the ancient world and within its political, administrative, and cultural dimensions, right? A great deal of the construction of the Romano-Germanic monarchies passes through, naturally, the Roman models, right? This has not to do properly with how these powers consider themselves from an ethnical point of view, but literacy, having a chancery, writing documents, this passed through Latin culture, and these educated elites that also fundamentally blended with the Germanic ones, and built in turn a different model, naturally, from which the one that Rome had been, but that of which much evidently survived, especially in written culture, as we have stressed. So. The church had, as we know, inherited from the organization of the Roman state a great deal of elements, importantly enough, the administrative districts, the dioceses, right? So if you look at the Romano-Germanic kingdoms, these were structured substantially on the cities, basically, right? Even where this, centers had less importance, like in Northern Gaul or in Britain, still these became the centers of, first of all, of the ecclesiastical organization, and then of markets, and of of a world that, albeit also built on a rural dimension, in the sense that, of course, all these societies were agricultural, but what I mean is that, for example, if you take the Merovingian kings, they famously lived in their country households, right? Cities were important at the time, but they weren't at least they were in different ways across Europe, a model of, the administrative centers proper, right? And this is naturally more evident in the Mediterranean, where this continuity is much stronger, much more evident than in the north, but that fundamentally includes in all these kingdoms the ecclesiastical administration. The diocese, according to the Roman Catholic model, is centered in the city. The only notable exception was the Irish one, that for a time was prevalent, as you know, also in Anglo-Saxon England, as the Anglo-Saxons were evangelized, in part already. There was an ecclesiastical administration in England built, in fact, by the Irish missionaries. Then eventually, after with Gregory the Great, there is the Romanization of the Anglo-Saxon churches. Let's call it better in this way. But that was the standard, right? And it was unchanged ever since, right? So, and why is this important? Well, evidently for the territorialization of the Germanic dominations, right? That up to that point had been fundamentally semi-nomadic in nature, not much because they moved excessively, but because they were at least open to do it, and because they didn't have a great deal of permanent structures at a local level, right? So the Roman world functions in a very, very different way. And that's why the Germanic kings, the monarchies that emerged, by the way, largely in these kingdoms from realities that before the settlement hadn't known anything like that, right? That are evidently inspired by the Roman monarchic model, in this sense that the church also reflected, right? So this is the enormous deal. And of course, the city keeps living in this sense, and the city is naturally is an articulate society. It's stratified, it's functionalized. It's by definition, a great area of fundamentally of management that requires written culture, right? That represents this hub of the international trade that still existed, right, in spite of the brusque contraction of early medieval times compared to the previous centuries, but still existing, still having the same role, right? So in spite of decadence, the city never dies out, especially in Mediterranean, but also in many other areas. I mean, if you look at continental Spain, continental Gaul, right, they're still there, even in Britain, right? So and beyond this world. And from Rome, by the way, came also the third lingua sacra, that is Latin, right? That was the only one to be known in the West during the High Middle Ages, right? Since Hebrew was practically unknown also to the most cultivated biblical commentators. And the knowledge of Greek, at least since the beginning of the 7th century, had become essentially the prerogative of very rare intellectual figures that were often remembered historically, essentially, in fact, for these linguistical merits, right? But this area of the empire that is important to stress was also in contact in the previous centuries, and if you look in Gaul, there was plenty of Syrian merchants, craftsmen. I mean, there was all this broader Hellenistic dimension that the Roman Empire had been. But in a moment of decadence of the city, and especially in the proportionate re-expansion of the countryside, at least for importance, surely not in absolute terms, because we know that the country was generally impoverished in certain areas, but the concept is that the agricultural world, the continental one, the inner one, right, takes over again, and those were populations that fundamentally had been superficially touched by sometimes by the same Romanization, but even in places like Italy, for example, they had been fundamentally disconnected by this Hellenistic Mediterranean, right? So there is a very different culture that can be exemplified, especially exactly in Italy, because it's aside from southern Spain, the only place where you find still an important Byzantine presence, right? So with all a different model that in part naturally in early medieval times grows more homogeneous to the Western one than it actually seems, but that remains tied to the city, to a centralized administration, to the contacts via sea, essentially. So you find the Lombard world that is literally next door, like a few tens of kilometers away. That is the countryside, the peasantry, right? This world that had remained rural, in that sense, Italic, and fundamentally detached, even from written culture in part, right? Especially in late Roman times. I mean, even if in the past these people had been, in part, at least medium landowners, things like that, small landowners. Now they had grown to be colonists, and they basically just spent their lives working, right, breaking their backs in the fields for the domini or the latifundia, right? and surely didn't spend a great deal of time learning, studying, right? And illiteracy was naturally very high at this point. That it's as if, the certain specific elements of Western Europe, and it's surely diversified background, but now were, took over once again, especially in their properly Latin, Romance-speaking element, right? And Italy, again, represents a partial exception in this desolating landscape of total ignorance of Greek that so much at the time was known as, in Latin, like Graecum est non legitur. That is, Greek is essentially what you don't read, what you can't read, right? So what is not to be read even, because it didn't circulate a great deal, right? There is a fascinating history of also these last cultivated, especially small, even aristocrats that kept, cultivating this reds from classical antiquity in their zooteculae, right, in this small, households scattered in Europe, and places, especially like southern Gaul, these areas that had maintained a closer contact with classical culture, and that felt even partly be the heirs of, not without much mistake, let's say, but it's evident that for the rest, because simply Greek manuscripts didn't circulate anymore, and people didn't need essentially to learn. Right, it's not that there weren't, Byzantine merchants that came in south of Gaul and that still spoke the language, but the local population really didn't, it wasn't framing that world anymore, right? Actually, southern France is one of the few places where this might have been actually less true, right? But still overwhelmingly so, and it's rather in Italy that there is a continuity, right, with Greek. Especially in certain areas, naturally. And because compared to the rest of Western Europe, some regions of, especially in the south of the peninsula, had, if not Greek, but probably Greek-speaking population, right? Within the same Rome, that at this point, as you know, is this enormously irradiating center of literacy, of written culture. I mean, the popes evangelize the Anglo-Saxons. They connect with all the various church. Let's call them even sort of national churches, because now every area, let's say every region had its own, right? The Italic church is more directly under the influence of Rome, but already, for example, the Cisalpine Gaul, what would become Lombardy proper under the Longobards, has another liturgy of some sort. Even Ravenna, that is within theoretically the same Roman Empire in this period with Rome, is developing a slightly different culture. The Visigoths have their own, the Merovingians have their own, the Anglo-Saxons have their own. Rome was, however, evidently, besides having the Christian primacy of honor as a metropolitic seat, it was by far, the most culturally advanced city at least in Western Europe, right? And it would remain like this for at least, I think, the 12th century, right? All these, if you could see this dimensionally, it's as if this eternal wave of books, of literates, of ideas, of stuff that irradiate from Rome all over, especially towards the north, because at this point Rome is building, right? The papacy is building this net of relations that will be at the base, even with the future developments of with the Carolingian imperial crowning, but also the late eventual papal monarchy, all plurisecular process that we have discussed in other videos. Now we don't need to repeat, but it's evident that from the other side, there was the Byzantine Empire that Rome was still technically in, and that the papacy, however, couldn't really oppose culturally, because it was an enormous power that was still, essentially the greatest, holding the part of the greatest legacy of a great deal of classical antiquity, right? It's important to stress that, as we were saying before, at this point, these two cultures are slowly distantiating, right? They are slowly looking at themselves as something separated from a cultural point of view. I mean, the empire is still there. It's still thought by everybody, literally, up to Britain included, as the universal one. Nobody is questioning this, that there's not the idea that the empire has fallen, right? No, there is no realization of that. Also because it wasn't true objectively. But also there is this realization that had started, by the way, within the same late Roman times. I mean, think about banally the administrative split between East and West, right? This was not just, arbitrary, right? There was an obvious reality in this. It was a great division between essentially a Latin, Celtic, and Greek, Semitic world, let's put it in this way, approximately, without taking away to the Germans, to the Egyptians, right, respectively. But it was definitely, I mean, people did speak other languages, did especially even when we think about literacy in the Roman Empire. We don't have to think about a reality where everybody could literally read or was used to write and to understand everything, as if, people were literate back in the day like we are, and then eventually the Middle Ages happened, right? The written culture in the ancient world was a much more primitive and sterile mechanism and function than we often think. The same goes with reading. Many people would be surprised to know that actually the Romans, for example, read much more than the Greeks in practice, right? And I'm not kidding, right? This is not an opinion. We know it, that, the great Hellenistic libraries were unattended. Nobody entered there. There were just, places where, just a few literate, of course, would go there every once in a while to read. Just a tiny part of the infinite amount of knowledge was collected there. I mean, places like Rome, in other parts of the West, I mean, people went to the libraries at least to have someone reading to them. That is much more interesting, and there was a practicality here, but we will have to make a video about this, because some of the most beautiful, albeit eccentric compared to my interests, university exams, classes and I attended back in the day were about this. And there is a great misconception, I presume, at least in popular culture, about what culture, even in the mythical, classical world, actually was. And it was very far from the modern and free thinking and and free in general world we imagine, like intellectually. There was nothing like a free thinker properly at the time, as we intended, especially when we look at historiography quite easily. But this is another issue. But coming back to Rome, this was the only city in Western Europe where, well, would accept maybe other Byzantine cities in southern Italy, but definitely Rome being the largest center, and easily also the second largest city of the empire after Constantinople. It was some acre larger, but right. We're talking about really a big center, but I don't know why we have to stress at some point even Rome fell as a city, because it's not really like that, right? It happened chiefly during the Gothic War, but still for those time standards, in relative terms, was indeed the most important city and the largest city in Western Europe. And this was an area where we find, even epigraphically speaking, quite easily, in the urban reality proper of the city, a great Greek presence, right? And we're not talking about, necessarily, because there was an ethnically consistent amount of people that came from the Greek-speaking areas. I mean, there were definitely quarters populated by the Greeks, by the Syrians, etc. But it was mostly about the importance in the functionality of the figures that were there, right? Think about, for example, the great monastic migrations of the 7th and of the 8th century that were even, from Byzantine subjects fundamentally who fled from the Islamic invasions, but later on even by the same Byzantine iconoclastic persecutions, right? And these refugees from places like Egypt, like Syria, weren't like, like a poor people, or they were some of the most highly intellectually developed and also rich people that were around the Mediterranean by that time, right? Naturally, those changes had brought them even to be unhinged from their context, from their background, but they came to Rome, that they evidently saw as a safe harbor and as a place where their essentially Greek education, right, was accepted, where they could find a role even in city administration, in how, in the context with Constantinople. There were lots of ties in this regard. The same goes even with Sicily. Like before as you know, Sicily had some areas of properly, eventually, even after the schism, there were still, Orthodox, under the Normans, for example, Orthodox monasteries. There was this close Greek contact, right? Then it was revived actually also during the High Middle Ages. It's not completely like a direct continuity from the classical past. Actually, there is a few of that, telling the truth. But all the enormous amount of latifundia that the popes held in Sicily, right? That they lost with the Arab. In part actually with the iconoclastic persecutions, but also and definitely naturally with the Islamic invasion of Sicily, and also this brought, at that point actually, that's when the papal culture Latinizes back again, right? It assumes a much more properly Italic character, because it's restricted to that, basically. And also that's the moment in which the connections with the Carolingians increase. So Rome starts turning, at least also more to, that had already been the case, as we've seen before, but in at equal levels in the way towards the north than they had done towards the east, right? And it would remain in the middle ground, very cleverly exploiting the situation also. But we can't say that in this early medieval time, the ancient capital of the empire was a religiously Italo-Greek city, right? We know that Greek cities circulated and that the contacts with the Byzantine world were intense. It remains, though, the fact that the ecclesiastical Latin, that is simplified and closer version to the spoken language of the 4th, 5th century than to Cicero's prose, let's say, was throughout all the Middle Ages the world of the language of the church, right? Even though it was not understood by the European populations, not even the ones of Romance origin, right? Because as we were saying before, all those people back in the countryside that had been substantially emarginated, transformed in labor workers during late Roman times, that lost education, they had detached their culture from the elite, right? So the elite that eventually kept being embodied by the bishops, right, the episcopal net, and also those that kept having at least contact with the Eastern world, or however, eventually were, like in the Carolingian Empire, began to be substantially educated, classical education in part. In still the church, telling the truth. Had developed another language, right? The countryside spoke a different language. And this is normal, right? Even after hundreds of years of Roman domination, many areas of Western Europe didn't actually speak Latin, right? They understood it, right? They had their corrupted version of it. And just to stress the fact that even the Roman Empire wasn't wasn't actually like an homogeneous thing, right? Just the administration had to work knowing Latin. Even the soldiers, yeah, they knew how to understand orders in Latin, but they still spoke different languages after all. So it was a very functional and practical way of looking at it. It was not an intense, let's say, introduction to a Latin culture, an awareness where everybody would speak it, right? But it's obvious that there was also in Western Europe, in centuries of imperial history, of imperial domination, obviously the Romanization of the language, conversely, right? So that, I don't know, Gaul spoke Celt. Yeah, Celt is not a dramatically distant language from Latin. Actually, they're pretty similar, but they're still different languages. Yet Gaul spoke a Romance language, even in the north, that was mostly influenced by the Germanic element after the Frankish invasion. Well, they spoke still Langue d'Oïl eventually. That's not German, that's Romance, right? So medieval civilization acquired through these dynamics the characteristics of a bilingual world, right? In everyday life, everybody, including the clergy, spoke in vernacular, right? This may seem banal, but think about it. But when it took to write, at least for, let's say, up to the year 1000 roughly, it was used, except very rare exception, Latin. Right. Naturally, the history of written vernacular would be very interesting to explore, and we will do it another time. It's obvious that in places like France or Germany, vernacular came out as a literary language, that is, a written language, earlier, right? Because people had not passed, especially in Germany, had not been mediated through a time in which they had spoken a Romance language. So that's the Germanic was their language, and that's how they eventually began to write it, right? In France, it happens more similarly because, after all, the Latin influence was lower. But in places like Italy, for example, vernacular came to be very late. A written language, right? Even though it was actually much more linguistically developed and sophisticated than the other vernaculars in Europe. And this is quite fascinating because it makes you realize that was this not just a bilingualism, but a kind of two different paradigms to address reality. The one of everyday life was very, complex and vivacious and, refined, right? As the emergence of Italian literature would show, and Latin instead as an official language, right? And what is fascinating, especially again about Italian literature, is that Italian emerges basically as a literary language from a day to another, right? Because there is no, while with other vernaculars, especially of Germanic origin, you can see that there was this gradual passage in which even the problem of putting the thing written down was a problem. Think about, Anglo-Saxon, what still influences actually has influenced the pronunciation of the English language today. The fact that these people didn't write, so they had also to cope with Latin alphabet in writing down their own sounds, which needed different phonemes, etc., to be graphicized, right? And I don't know how to say it specifically, but with this other more, this closer language to Latin, actually the thing happened only when these were very already built, right? Think about Dante, that basically not even basically 1 century after Italian became a vernacular language, basically speaks in the most refined vernacular in medieval European literature, talking about every single range of topic from the highest to lowest, and having always this incredible semantic depth and shade. So this naturally makes you also understand how different after all, behind this bilingualism, European languages, of course, but also Britain culture were, right? And consider naturally that before Charlemagne, there was no thing like a common script, right? So especially France, Germany, and Italy were framed from a relatively early time under this homogenization of the script that favored a big deal also the internal cultural development of these countries, and that eventually expanded into the rest. But before Carolingian times, if you wrote an insular language, you could be barely understood. In Britain, formed by, I don't know, someone from Spain that had the Visigoth script, right? The same goes for the Merovingian script, the Beneventan script that had even some regional, provincial variations. Everything was very complicated, and this was somewhat an obstacle, right? So actually, the Carolingian reform of script is one of the single most influential and impacting written reforms that have ever been carried out. That, as simple as it may seem, right? They were thinking, for example, to imitate the classical Roman script. Well, they were actually imitating one of the later Roman Empire. Was already different, but it's the same that we still use today, because it was not just a graphic, an alphabet used to for mere mechanical function. It was also a way of conceiving, nonetheless, than Europe, right? Europe owes much in this unitary frame, especially from a cultural point, Britain culture, right? Manuscripts I think monastic centers have been very correctly defined as the connective tissue of post-Carolingian Europe. In the moment when even the Carolingian Empire collapses, there is barely nothing centralized ever for centuries. What you really have that makes this world communicating, contacting, interacting, enriching itself, expanding its cultural horizons are monastic centers and their scriptoria, right? All across Europe, thanks to a lot of events, including in this time the spread of Benedictine monasticism that also had, as you know, pushed a big deal the idea that Britain work was a duty, right? That there was the awareness that this great gift, there was a great power and a great fatigue, right? As we will see also now, to write, but it was done for God's love, right? There was the idea that naturally the Bible is a written text, and there can't be in a Christian society an illiterate society in this regard. At least who controls it, or who is deputed to the spread of Christianity itself, must, without any exception, must be literate, right? Which is also what pushed the Carolingians to reform their own world themselves, because actually the Carolingian clergy before Charlemagne was not even understanding the Bible literally. Like they couldn't know how to translate it. They were inventing some of the worst heresies that eventually didn't spread because there were simple mistakes of linguistical interpretation. But the Carolingian clergy was barely literate in first place before Charlemagne, and it was, well, there would be a lot to add regarding to this, but let's go on. Observing that literacy was cured in early medieval Europe almost exclusively by the clergy and the monks, right? And importantly enough, for merely for liturgical spiritual ends, right? So this was a language that also characterized itself in a somewhat properly ecclesiastical horizon, right? It this influenced the same lexicon, the same vocabulary, the use of it in itself, of Latin itself. And literacy also, for example, the term literatus, right, was used, so the literate was used to designate he was capable of reading and writing, right? And in the ancient world, this could be everybody who knew how to write. Like a Roman would say, I don't know, even a Greek guy that didn't speak a word of Latin was a literatus in Latin, right? While in the Middle Ages, the term literatus is virtually identical to he who knows how to write in Latin, because there was no other way to write, right? There was not an option, right? If you wonder why this is the case, you have to enter this mindset which it doesn't even make sense to think that there can be another language that can be written in this regard, right? Also because the Bible was translated in Latin, and that was the language of Western Europe in this regard, right? Or at least was studied in Western Europe. And what else did you need? So there was a divarication as a consequence, obviously, and a growing one, by the way, between the world of orality and the world of writing. And the one of writing was essentially an almost exclusive prerogative of the men of church, right? And as we've seen, it was used essentially for religious aims, right? Adopting, therefore, a sacral character that it had basically never had as such in the Roman antiquity, right? The relation with the Romans with writing in this sense was much more, as we've seen before, mechanical and functional, right? Latin had emerged not as the language of a holy, a holy text, for example. It was simply, the vernacular that the Latins had spoken, and that they had extended the Roman expansion over the other Italic peoples and then over the rest of Europe, right? And what is fascinating, by the way, in Romance philology is that you see that many, like for example, the Iberian languages that end very often with the S. This typically was more an Italic influence than a properly Roman one. In fact, the ecclesiastical Latin is much closer, after all, and Italian with it, to the classical Latin as such, right? For example, in Romania, we know that there are elements that basically correspond to the linguistical legacy of the places where the legionaries that were settled there actually came from, in certain specific areas of the Apennine. Right, just to tell you even how the diversification had occurred before even medieval times, because already in the Roman Empire there were many different Latins, right? Do you think that what Cicero wrote was what people in the streets actually spoke like? Absolutely not, right? And that would have been still Rome. What about 300 kilometers away? But it's important to stress here that there is this sort of mediation that ecclesiastical Latin represents towards the medieval Christians in this regard, because it's definitely a language that is not understood by everybody, right? Especially as we have seen in most faraway regions from the Mediterranean. So it was still somewhat a weapon, right? Because not only the most educated, there are the elite, speak it, but also you don't understand it. And that's a pretty sound limit, an important one that, had problems, these things that are changed. For example, I think about the Vatican Council, the second, 20th century, and that you see there that, there was a great debate over, it still there is in theory and in practice, about how should the Mass be celebrated, like in the vernacular languages or in Latin, right? And there is a legacy behind Latin in this sense that is more than just linguistical. It has a sort of almost exoteric character, right? A sacral, a hieratic, an authoritative one. It's very important for a papacy that still speaks Latin as its official language. And the being Christianity, naturally, as like for Judaism and in Islam, meant to be, part of the religions of the book, right? That there is a religion in which the truth is preserved and enclosed in a written text that is presented as inspired by God and therefore not susceptible of change. The Bible is the book per excellence, right? The meaning of the Greek term ta biblia, right, is in fact the books, as we know, right? And this can be interpreted and kind of commented, but always literally preserved, right? There is a sacrality that had been emphasized naturally with the Christianization of the empire, and that went in parallel with the social stratification, the sinking in literacy, that you can even see artistically speaking when you observe late Roman and Byzantine, beautiful mosaics that you can find in Constantinople, in Ravenna, in these places that at the time were expressing this more powerfully, this concept that where you see that the book is closed, and it's often all gilded and embossed like all these precious stones, etc. So what does this mean? Is that the fact that the book is closed, while in the previous centuries had represented generally as open and somewhat easily accessible, somewhat even calling people in when still the population of the empire were not Christianized officially. What you see in this enclosing is the symbolic importance of the Bible as such. Like, it was not an oath, it was not anymore one of the many religions existing within the empire. It was the religion of the universal empire. Universal means that it's the only possible empire in the whole universe proper. And this is a concept of the one of perpetua sanctio that is expressed, for example, also by the Theodosian Code, by this crystallization of society that followed also the Constantinian reforms, etc., for which there is like a given, in this case, a text, truth, a single truth, right? And that it can't be changed. Like, I think like this in a world that objectively didn't have a great deal of energetic technological potential, so change was normally imperceptible in terms even of advancements where it existed, or even in regression where it happened as well. And therefore it was normal for the time that at one point a powerful state that established this orthodoxy and tried to control society would stress the fact that this was the perfect one, right? There was no alternative. And everything was intended at all levels of society through this way. The same goes for the language. Latin in Western Europe is the only sacral language allowed. It's the only written language proper, right? It was not the only one in the sense that someone else couldn't write in another language, but it was so standard in this regard, because effectively most people couldn't read in the first place, and the only who did, for the reasons that we have explained, did it in Latin in the West, that it was perceived as the only as the language, not even one of the many. Right, so and consider it from, the average of the perspective of the average peasant of Auvergne in the 7th century. What the hell did they know about the surrounding world? I mean, the average one, and because the elites, of course, always knew about this, but a peasant, a priest speaking Latin, but he was framed in such a different, usual dimension, his own agricultural work and natural cycles and tormented existence and the weather and all this stuff that, it was all part of a fixed picture, we could say. There is another important aspect to stress that has to do with the boost given by Carolingian reforms to philology, right? It was fairly timid. As we have seen, the Carolingian world was not dramatically advanced from an intellectual point of view. Even Charlemagne's court was populated by, as we know, literates coming from literally the whole empire and beyond, right? Franks, Longobards, but even Visigoths and Anglo-Saxons, famously enough. Think about Eginhard, that even writes Charlemagne's biography, as we will see now. But still, it was a very restricted milieu, right? Those who really will change a big deal the thing, will start applicating philology to even the construction, for example, of an imperial ideology at literally an institutional level, are the Ottonians, right? But this however, starts from the Carolingian times, right? Because before Carolingian times, aside from the various ecclesiastical centers, there hadn't really been a center of such a large community with such different problems to solve collectively than in the Carolingian Empire, which in fact gave start to this exactly for this reason, right? It was not just a way of saying, okay, let's have humanists for the sake of it, right? It was a way of needing literate people who could represent the empire, who could help dealing with the literacy, right? Reforming the monasteries, the same church, etc. So people of great intellectual horizons for those time standards. And we must also not forget ever that philology was born in this sense out of the inexhaustible and inextinguishable, right? A thought which is typical of the medieval mind to reconstruct the biblical text in its own authenticity, right? It was not a matter of saying, okay, we have just a plain version of what we should learn. We should also understand what it means, right? And this is something that, for medieval mindset, is probably the moment. Let's say it's probably the greatest example of inexhaustible thirst of knowledge in human history, right? We assume that medievals were ignorant and kind of proud of it. Not even during the Enlightenment, people like in the Middle Ages were so much in honest, sincere, and immediate need of knowledge, and esteeming it as a luxury, right? And always searching for it, like trying to decipher this great mystery that creation, right, is, and that God has created for mankind to be deciphered, right? In the Enlightenment, we were mostly obsessed about creating a categorization, right, of getting the precise point of that you could fit into an encyclopedia and use it eventually, like applicated mechanically. The medieval mind is standing over nothing, and therefore has to go beyond, to make an enormous effort to find a fixed center. And they understand that this fixed center, even when is present in the form of the Bible, it's not enough. The Bible is the word of God, but it has to be interpreted, right? There are things, there's a divine mystery, right? The figure of Christ embodies it to the fullest, for which mankind is not to passively obey the Bible, it is to applicate it in a world where he doesn't know how to do it, and has to find the way out all the single time, right? And it's not simple. This is what pushes the gigantic intellectual effort of medieval civilization. Because no civilization in proportion to its amount of knowledge was capable of achieving so much like the medieval one. Look at scholastics. There's no equivalent in any other historical time to that reshaping of the way we look at the world comprehensively from a scientific point of view, from a religious point of view, from a moral point of view, that is capable of integrating things that had been external up to that point, like the Aristotelic system. It is a hell of a system, by the way. We are surely not capable of doing anything like that anymore, not thinking it in that grand dimension. We aren't anymore. We're not required anymore by a certain standard, but we're also, in this sense, intellectually inferior to who was able to stress the necessity even just of it, because it was primarily a moral problem. It was not much the intellectual achievement in itself, but the instrumental reason for it that is mind-blowing. So, among the other things, another typical phenomenon of the medieval age was, for many centuries, this separation between the teaching of writing and the one of reading, right? Many people find it weird, right, to, for example, imagine that they could write without being able to read, right? And it is actually very frequent instead to find readers that are absolutely incapable of holding, a pen. And very famous in this sense is the case of Charlemagne himself, that according to his biographer Eginhard, that was a layman, but very cultured at the time. So you even see the existence, however, of a lay interest, of a lay dimension after all, right? It wasn't just the church, or better, this wasn't an exclusivistic or a cryptic or a, elitistic attitude from the side of the church to say, okay, we're the only ones who know how to read. Because among laymen, there was actually great interest, not much for reading itself, but for knowing, right? And there were simply many different ways of knowing, and also many different things to know, right? How much of folklore has been lost, not because the church destroyed it, but simply because they didn't write about it, because a father of the church said, okay, only what I hear about this ancient scientific treatise, this passage, so the Christian would copy just the one that had been quoted by the authority. But even later, right, we know much more what a monk thought in these times than what a knight did, or even a peasant. About peasantry, we know basically nothing, right, in their mindset. And that's obvious because they did not write, and they didn't need to do it, because you don't have to think, especially at this time, of the peasant just as a guy that is there, is hopelessly a serf and just, working the land, right? Peasant communities at this time, as always, have been, by the way, radically violent and aggressive-minded and, greedy, and they were absolutely negotiating with their own, with the powerful, with the lords, with the church, but they didn't write things down. They simply signed, they agreed things, they made word contract, everything was oral at this time, right? Even in court, right? You didn't need to write, you didn't need to appear in front of the community and to speak. And that was a legal act, a perfectly valid juridical act, right? So, once again, we don't have to reason in terms like, oh, those poor guys, they weren't literate, right? It's like the people who can't read today. No, today it's a very different situation, in which there are actually people who that prevent others not to read because they want to maintain the dictatorships and poverty to impose their power. At the time, it wasn't anything like that. Reading or writing was not a necessity. You could technically learn everything by heart, as people did. Right, there was an oral dimension was overwhelming here. In all the illiterates, what about Northern Europe? These people learned everything by heart. And even the clergy, it was absolutely not strange to find someone who knew the Bible by heart at the time. And people, by the way, used their minds. So learning by heart, this capacity of memorizing in massively overdeveloped way compared to our own. These people could, I hope you have read the Bible at least once in your life, You know how much that is. These people knew how to learn it by heart. Think about doing it today. Were you to find a person willing to do it and having actually the time to? These people were used to do it, right? Because they didn't play video games all the day long, but while they worked, for example, they sang, they spoke, they sang these litanies, these formulas that were all framed within the vision of the world in itself. Right, this mysterious forces that there was a sort of kind of portable encyclopedia. People were used to elaborate continuously in their minds, and this seemed to them, rightfully, like it is, objectively, from a scientific point of view, prodigious. Because we still don't understand what the heck the hell is going on in our mind. Nobody does, really. But we can do it, and these people pushed it to the point at which they were capable, in fact, of learning this enormous amount of stuff. Naturally, the orality and written culture were intertwined, right? And writing down helped a great deal in also in developing, intellectually speaking. This is not to say that orality is superior in writing down, but that's just a function. It was normal and absolutely, even, it's simply cheaper. You have an idea how much it costed to make a book. All the poor sheep that were butchered to have, those pages. Having a book was like having easily sometimes a Ferrari. If you were like the largest libraries at this point in history counted not more than 70 books. Having 70 manuscripts at the time was being literally one of the luckiest people in the world. Also, it was a very large asset. It was a prodigy, and people were obsessed about it. They were hunting for manuscripts, right? They were accumulating them, treasuring them, and all this exchange between monasteries was tied also to this intellectual curiosity of needing to find that in a philological intent, right? Because they were generally interested in reconstructing the texts. I mean, these people knew there had been a classical past, and they wanted to learn more about it. They were curious. They didn't have just religious interests, right? And that's also, unfortunately, part of our history we don't know much about, because once again, this thing existed, but it wasn't written down. People didn't used to write those things down on average. Just learned, they memorized, right? It was much easier to memorize one passage than finding the skin, right? To write things down, and it was very, 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 very costly, right? And think, in fact, about Charlemagne himself trying to desperately, like, even bringing tablets and pen to bed to keep under the pillow to exercise himself, even during the night, because he wanted so much to learn how to write. And he failed, right? And he was already a full-grown man. He was already a mature person. And yet he gave up, because it was very difficult for him to learn how to write. And at the base of such split between reading and writing, there are probably also social and ideological reasons. For example, in classical times, the copy of the text was entrusted preferably to slaves or freedmen that were absolutely trained for this task, right? For this function, and for this reason was somewhat not very well evaluated as such, right? Just like any other type of manual activity, right? Don't think of the Roman world like a humble time where, people were pursuing kind of a more democratic or popular policy, and they cared about work, and they were like modern people. No, the ancient world was as elitistic as the medieval one, right? What do you do? Manual work? Are you a slave? What the hell, right? That was the mindset. So even who writes, what's writing is just a slave work, and I don't care to do it, right? And everything, even in there, was a lot of orality, as we were saying before, including, public readings, things like these, which people naturally wanted to know things, but they didn't need to necessarily to read or write for it. Think about how logical dialectics and rhetorics were developed at the time. These were largely public, oral, functions that were performed in front of many people in the forum, etc. And so even the relation with written culture at that time was much more different than the one we do, right? Even the Romans took actually a lot of time before. Think about Roman law. We assume Romans were all about law. Well, actually, it took a long time before they systematized a law proper, an effective juridical system that was standardized, right? Everything was, much more autonomous sometimes locally than we think. Also, the classical world never actually developed an ethics of work, right? Like we know it, especially in the modern age. And the turning point in this sense was the passage between the Antiquity and the Middle Ages, because the copy of the manuscripts that was at this point practiced almost exclusively by the monks entered full title among those manual works that, for the fatigue that they entailed and also the scarce recognition that they enjoyed, were however still apt to attract divine benevolence over those who dedicated themselves to it, right? That is, you have to be, in a Christian mindset, more humble, right? There is really nothing bad in working, even manually, even if it is objectively tiring and extenuating, and it's an exercise that actually Saint Benedictine rule associated to agricultural work, right? The same Bibles in the Benedictine monasteries that were just huts at the beginning, right? They had these very small primitive closets in which they put together the Bible all together with agricultural tools, right? That's and think even about the importance of a book at the time, as we've seen. Like, these people were often starving, right? Sometimes with the agriculture was a disaster, especially when the Benedictine rule was founded proper. But they still had a book within it, because they stressed that that book could give them the sap for survival as much as agricultural tools could provide them with vegetables and the means necessary for subsistence, right? So this is a very different way of, and it's also an interiorization of let's say of ethics at levels that in the ancient world had not existed. Objectively, Christianity brought a deep change in ethics in general. I mean, it split this material from spiritual dimension in a much more subtle and critical and non-obvious way, right? That requires a constant individual commitment. And writing, therefore, was for a long time an ascetic activity that was described in some marginal notes or in the colophons, for example, of the manuscripts, as particularly harsh, right? The fingers hurt, right? And say the scribes throughout all the Middle Ages, the eyes suffer, right, for the scarce light, right? The neck is tense, and also the muscles of the back get harder, and therefore all the body is committed in this very tiring and also scarcely gratifying activity. And these people ask very often, even when they stopped writing, like really writing a manuscript by hand was an enterprise, right? And therefore you even find at the end of these manuscripts like, God, please, pay me back for all the effort I made, right? And from this relative devaluation of writing activity had been derived also the distinction between the dictator, right? He who conceives and gives form to a text, right? By caring about the style, for example, and the scriptor, that is, he who is entrusted with the actual writing, right? And it was a great planning, also because given that the skin was so costly, there was definitely very careful planning on codicologically on how the manuscript had to be built and written in the first place, right? So there was a very highly codified system for doing it. Think about all the people that just even worked for working the skin, making it, cutting properly, like making it smooth, right? There's a whole process that costed. I mean, it really costed a lot. People made a living on this, and lots of resources were spent for it. And this proves naturally, in turn, once again, how important knowledge was in the Middle Ages, how much wealth was invested in it. There's no comparison for today. I mean, compared our economical situation to the one of the time, I mean, we don't invest anything about in knowledge compared to what the Middle Ages did. And naturally, also the dictator and the scriptor could overlap as figures, especially in those areas where there were actually less people working at it, right? So that people were a bit doing the whole thing on their own because either they had less means or they had less commitments, etc. And when there are also, and naturally, fewer individuals that are capable of writing autonomously, right? But in many other contexts that are also the prevalent ones numerically, this is definitely not true. That is to say, once again, in the early medieval times, after all, there was a great development of the educational systems. So this phase that we have described, that goes from roughly the 6th to the 8th century, the men of church that were the only holders of satisfactorily a culture was satisfactorily capable of expressing itself in a creative and autonomous way, the preservation of historic memory, right? History was seen as, once again, compared to modern times, much, much more importantly in the Middle Ages than today, right? History was a way to not just to remember something that had occurred in the past in today's society, mostly for trivial reasons, right? But for defining the present in a political and socially, let's say, committed way, right? Writing an historiographical work meant to really express a value of civilization. And we owe to some of the greatest writers of the early Middle Ages, in fact, not just the, sometimes, and obviously inaccurate, or somewhat, even imaginative conception of the historical reality, but, and this is the most important thing, actually a vision of the world that telling the truth tells us much more in historical terms, in terms of historical precision, than a mere list of details that we would like to know it today. And we often misconceive, in fact, the importance of these texts, right? As much as we misconceive the importance of medieval civilization as a whole, right? We do have a big problem in our society still to understand that we don't have to read history in the sense that we are the progressed, intelligent, beautiful, smart ones, and these were, idiots because, you have created this kind of set of your personal standards, your egocentric standards, that if these guys that they're not fitted by these guys, that they're stupid, right? Because actually there is a deeply rooted intellectual inferiority in believing this in the first place. If you pretend to read Gregory the Great or Bede the Venerable, Paul the Deacon, pretending that they're writing the reality, I mean, you are an idiot, right? And these people were massively more intelligent than you. I mean, easily, hands down. There's no doubt entirely about this. Never think that you're more intelligent or more capable than a person who lived 1,000 years ago or more. Because you're not, I can assure you. So we think about Gregory, Bishop of Tours, that we meant here, descending from this aristocratic family of Gallo-Roman origin, right? So this belonging definitely to the elite, right? And without him, we wouldn't know about the settlement and the success of the Merovingian dynasty in the Gaul of the 5th and the first decades of the 6th century. Right? All the values attached once again in this great effort of reconciliation of values and the stressing values of civilization, in the integration of the Franks within the Gallo-Roman hierarchy, in the foundation of the Merovingian kingdoms, the kingdom of the pacification of Gaul, the establishment of an order, the conversion of the Franks, the stressing of the ecumenic order in the Gallic reality. I mean, do we try to see this even remotely possible as an option towards a current polity, right? Even as a moral intent, right? And a monk of refined culture of Anglo-Saxon origin, Bede the Venerable, right? He left us the witness of the Christianization of the Germanic peoples that had settled in the British Isles. I don't know if you ever read certain passages from Bede, but I mean, this person would have an incredible poetic sensitivity. The way he describes the fly of the sparrow within the whole of the Anglo-Saxon chieftain with his stains, right? And it says, it seems to me that life is just this one. It's like the fly of the sparrow for a moment, right? It comes from the cold, from the darkness, and passes through this hole with fire and people gathering, having this mundane reality of the Thanes, men of war, bloody, violent, etc. And then going back out of the other part of the window, of the other side of the hall, and getting once again in the darkness, in the snow, right? And that's the mystery of life, presented to a powerful that is believing he has everything because he has a hole, he has a household, his taints, his power, etc. And he tells him, look at what life is, this mystery, and you can't be satisfied just of this material dimension. I mean, these are the words of civilization. And Paul the Deacon, right, descending from a Longobarд family of Friuli, and later on monk at Monte Cassino, that writes down the memory of the epic and tormented history of the Longobards from the mythical Scandinavian origins and their moment of greatest splendor that coincides with the kingdom with the reign of Liutprand, right? And that reasserts in a Christian key However, this ethnic Germanic pride of the Longobard people, once again in a value of civilization, in a value of conversion, in a value of order, of justice, that however does not betray the ancient ethnic origin and this national feeling that had distinguished the Longobards from all the other Romano-Germanic kingdoms, by the way, that had somewhat inspired themselves. We're in other different levels to the imperial models. The Longobards were stuck to the... We are the Longobards. Nothing else, right? This is our land, and we don't have anything to do with the empire. We don't need that, and that's also one of the greatest threads in absolute terms of early medieval literature. So you see, when we talk about the so-called Dark Ages, I mean, I don't think anybody legitimately talks about the Dark Ages anymore, if not for stressing that, yeah, in absolute terms, we have less documentation. It's not that these were Dark Ages by any stretch of the imagination, like just an imbecile could think anything like that. But, I mean, just reflect on the fact that we, as a civilization, for centuries, we have grossly misunderstood. We have been grossly mistaken about the value of civilization that the early Middle Ages represented. Right, passing, studying this simply even just to Britain culture. It was not it was not prevalent at the time, as we have seen. First of all, shows you these masterpieces, but also makes you understand how much there was beyond this world, orally transmitted. All things that eventually were written down, in particular about the sagas, the Germanic epic. I mean, all this colorful, insightful, incredibly devastatingly and tragically poetic conception of the destiny of the world. I mean, some the most beautiful achievement that still flow in our veins. This is what we come from, right? It's not a matter of saying now we are rational and evolved, because we still live by the values that these societies let us having, after all, thanks to this work, thanks to this restless effort of writing, right? It was a great fatigue and a great sacrifice, right? And a huge amount of assets spent, right, for having us today such treasures, and we don't even care about them. Shame on our civilization. I don't have other ways to put in it. So, well, I think we can stop it today. Yeah. Every once in a while, I think it was from last year that I didn't talk about written culture. But, as you know, I choose my topics randomly, so anyhow, this adds up to the list we already made. So for now, I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming contents. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.